Hey, it's Rachel. When I posted a video a couple weeks back on our fall garden plan, I wanted to get into like buckwheat and how I'm using it, and I just didn't have time. So I'm making that a whole separate topic today. First, why a cover crop at all? I mean, for most home gardeners, it might not be necessary. I will say for me, I have really bad soil. It was heavy clay. This is the first year we've put a garden there. We literally just flipped the sod over, kind of clay side up. We did a whole video on it. We worked some organic matter in at that time, but it needs all the help it can get. So by putting in a cover crop, I get the roots from that crop into the soil. So there's a living root in the soil all the time, which is really important. And then when I terminate the cover crop and dig it in, that's even more organic content. The other thing about a cover crop, especially now when you're going from a summer garden to a fall garden, it shades the soil, and that's really good for moisture retention. It's also really good for just keeping the soil cool. And I mean, we've got temps in the 90s. The soil is kind of like a cast iron skillet. It takes a while for it to heat up, but then once it's hot, it also takes a long time for it to cool down. So when I get to this time of the summer, kind of end of summer, fall's just around the corner, it's been soaking in the sun for a long time, and that if I don't give it some shade, that soil is going to get really, really hot. That can actually inhibit germination of different crops, and so keeping the soil cool is really important. So for those are the two reasons I use a cover crop, the organic matter and then just kind of shading and cooling and shielding my soil. The other thing here is buckwheat specifically. So I like buckwheat for two reasons. One, it grows really fast. So it goes from seed in the ground to a plant about this tall in 1 week. And then by the time you hit 4 weeks, it's probably about, you can't even see my hands, but it's about three feet tall, and maybe 2.5. And the nice thing about it, other than it being really fast growing, right? So I can fit it in between the spring crops coming out and the fall crops going in. So like as my spring lettuces were bolting, I would pull them out and throw down some buckwheat. As my squash has kind of petered out, or my beans, and I've got my second wave of those now growing, I took out the first wave of them, sprinkled down some buckwheat, right? So it's really, really flexible. You can just kind of add it as you're going and it'll grow. And then it also is amazing for pollinators. And I will try and actually work in a video of buckwheat with pollinators on it, but I already have a bunch of plants out in the garden that attract pollinators, but the buckwheat really kind of like fills a gap there. So for those reasons specifically, I really like buckwheat. So let me show you how I did the buckwheat. And in particular, I think at the end of this, I'm going to try and do a timeline and walk through how I work it in from a time perspective to make sure that I don't have to lose my harvest out of the garden as I'm working in the buckwheat. So these are buckwheat seeds. Look like large grape nuts to me, if you've ever eaten that cereal. So I went through, I removed my silage tarp that I was using to suppress weeds, and while I was at it, I cut down my arugula, which was totally bolted, and then I pulled out, did get a good thorough weeding of the bed for anything that was there. I left the things that were still in good shape in place, and I just planted the buckwheat at the base of them. And actually, as the buckwheat grew, it helped to shade the soil and keep the lettuce from bolting, which was nice. Watered it in really well. And then I tried to protect it with chicken wire to keep the birds from eating it, switched over to insect row cover. It was a lot easier. This is the finished product. It doesn't look especially beautiful, but hopefully this will protect the buckwheat while it germinates. And then I can take this cover off. It has been exactly 1 week since I planted out the buckwheat. I kept it covered for, I'd say like 4 or 5 days with that insect row cover while I kept it watered just to keep the birds from eating it. At this point, this is a nice healthy stand of buckwheat and it no longer needs bird protection. I just harvested the lettuce pretty heavily yesterday, and I really need to remember to film these things before I do that. So it looks a little sad because I just harvested it, but in reality, the lettuce has been doing really, really well. And I think that the row cover over the buckwheat had the additional benefit of giving the lettuce some shade. It's been in the 90s, it's been really hot, and I think that it was actually additional benefit as well of doing the buckwheat this way, is the lettuce got a little bit of help. So now that the buckwheat's getting taller, it can also provide some shade to the lettuce, and I will document that process as it goes along. I'm trying to get down at a lower angle here. As of right now, I would say the buckwheat is just about as tall as the lettuce. So it's not yet giving it a ton of shade directly onto the leaves, but it is, as you can see, shading the soil. And that's really what matters, is the soil temperature. So again, we've got a lot of hot temperatures. It's gonna start raining here in a few days and end this drought we've been having. But this buckwheat will hopefully spring back up and really help to shade out and cool this lettuce. So that's experiment one weekend, and I'll keep doing updates every week on how the buckwheat's doing. So here is the promised video with pollinators on the buckwheat, and as you can see, they totally love it. You do want to let it get to this stage to support our friendly neighborhood pollinator, but at that point you really want to cut it down. Once buckwheat sets seed, it will become an invasive weed the following year. You're going to be pulling baby buckwheat out all the time. But let me zoom in, you can see happy little bumblebee. So I let it get to this point, and then I cut it down and terminated it, and I'll show that process. While I was at it, I also removed the crops like celery and lettuces that were done. I took all of these residues, just chopped it down, and then I worked in through the top surface of the soil using a pitchfork. Got those residues a little bit covered up. You'll notice I left the tomatoes in place. I watered really well, and then I covered it with a silage tarp, which was white side up to help additionally cool the soil. So I wanted to talk about timing and how I make sure that I have an uninterrupted harvest, as I mentioned before. So if you look here from left to right, the top is the spring lettuce bed that I've been showing in this video, and then the bottom is a different bed where I grew kale in the spring. I eat a lot of kale, and my goal was never to be without it, basically. So the top bed, you know, you can kind of see I planted the buckwheat, I let it grow for 6 weeks, I terminated it, and I let it decompose. At the same time that I terminated it, I started my kale transplants indoors. And after that buckwheat residue is fully decomposed, I'm going to go ahead and put the fall plants, including that kale, into the bed. I'll be able to harvest them kind of like third week of September. I'll get like a baby kale leaf harvest. And then by the time we hit end of October, early November, I'll have fully mature kale. Now, the bed on the bottom is my spring kale. So I planted that and I've been harvesting it ever since. And my goal was to never interrupt that harvest. So what I've done, you can kind of see down below, the same time that I terminated the buckwheat in the first bed, I planted it at the base of the kale in the other bed. And same as the top one, I let it grow for 6 weeks, and then I terminate it. When I terminate it, I have to harvest all of the kale out of the bed at the same time. And, you know, same as I did before for the other one where I took out all the celery and all the lettuces and such. So what I've done here is timed it so that right around the time that I have to do this final kale harvest and terminate the buckwheat, the top bed is starting to give me at least baby leaves of kale. So this is just kind of to flag, it's a little complicated, and you definitely want to think about this and time it out. I love having a cover crop, and I'm glad that I'm using it, but it's not hard per se, but you do have to like think through how you're going to make sure you don't end up in a situation where you've got nothing but cover crops growing, because, you know, the whole point of this is for us to have a productive garden. All right, so that's the deep dive on buckwheat. I hope that was helpful. If anybody has other cover crops that they really like, let me know, post here. I will say at the end of the gardening season, I'm going to use a different kind of green manure mix and plant the beds to that, and then it will winter kill, and the few things in it that don't will come back in the spring and, you know, give me more soil coverage. So this is not meant to be like the cover crop to end all cover crops. Buckwheat is something I use specifically just in the summer. But I find that for me, at least, it's really, really good. It improves my soil. It's good for pollinators. It takes a little bit of kind of forethought and planning, as you saw here at the end. But overall, like, honestly, I do highly recommend it. And yeah, I think you should give it a shot if you haven't already. So anyway, thanks.